Hello and welcome to Talking General Practice, the podcast from GP Online. I'm Emma Bauer, the editor of GP Online. Today on the podcast, I'm speaking to Robert McCartney, a senior associate in the corporate commercial team at the law firm Hempsons, about the shift towards a neighbourhood NHS and what this could mean for the future of general practice. In this conversation, Robert outlines the potential impact new single and multi-neighbourhood provider contracts could have and discusses the growing trend of PCNs incorporating as limited companies in response to the changes. He also sets out some practical steps practices and PCNs can take now to prepare for what's coming. This episode is an extract from a recent video Robert and I did for our sister site GP Business's monthly briefing series. You can watch the full video, which also includes Robert's thoughts on the future of the partnership model, by visiting gpbusiness.co.uk. If you're a registered user of GP Online, you can use the same login details to access a limited amount of content on GP Business each month. If you're listening to this podcast, you know just how fast general practice is moving. To keep up, you need more than just headlines. A GP Online subscription gives you expert analysis on the latest news affecting general practice and how it impacts on you. A subscription to GP Online also gives you access to MIMS for prescribing information and MIMS Learning to help you complete your CPD. It's your daily briefing and your education platform in one. Subscribe now at GPonline.com. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to the studio Robert McCartney, who is a senior associate at the law firm Hempsons, where he works in the corporate commercial team, which specialises in advising primary and community care providers. Robert's here to talk about the move towards neighbourhood NHS and what this could mean for GP practices and PCNs, with a focus on some of the legal and contractual issues they may have to address. Thanks so much for coming to speak to us today, Robert.
Thank you for inviting me.
The government has said it intends to publish a framework for a model neighbourhood, and we're expecting that imminently. What do you think that framework will aim to address?
I feel it'll probably be fairly limited in detail, but kind of wide in aspiration. There's lots of suggestions in the framework for the ICBs, which suggests about how they might work together. There could be increased collaboration and integration kind of objectives. I don't expect it to be a complete answer to all the questions we have, but it should be a really good way to steer people in the right direction.
Because there's been quite limited details. We're expecting 2 new contracts to help deliver neighbourhoods, the single and the multi-neighbourhood provider contracts. I mean, in the 10-year plan, they were sort of billed as alternatives to the GP contract. Do you think that will be the case? How do you see those contracts potentially working?
Currently, the official line is what's written in the 10-year plan, so it is an alternative. From what we're hearing and discussions that have been had, I think, publicly in the various stakeholders, it seems unlikely to actually be an alternative. Alternative to us kind of implies the model similar to the PACS model that was fairly discussed, say, 10 years ago, where the idea is you could suspend your core contract and replace it with a new contract. It's unlikely that these will go that far. It's more likely to be built on the core contract and add additional work, a bit more aligned to how the PCN DES has developed.
There's a lot of speculation about what all this will mean for primary care networks. Do you see this single neighbourhood contract as being something that will replace PCNs either straight away or in the longer term, do you think?
It may do in the long term. There could well be a push to consolidate the services under the neighbourhood, which would justify the change, but not in the short term. There is too much that's required to make that change. It simply could not be implemented, certainly not between now and April. And it'd probably be a push to complete it by next April.
Right.
But that's not to say that couldn't be the aspiration in the future. It might be more likely that the PCNs could be rebranded and restructured and become neighbourhoods rather than have the PCN kind of labelling going forward.
There's been a bit of a trend in the last couple of years for PCNs to start looking to incorporate and become companies. Have you seen an increase in this recently? And is this something that networks should consider given everything that's going on?
Yes, we have seen an increase in them. Although many of the PCNs that have already incorporated over the last few years, we're actually also seeing a shift in how they are actually developing and looking at how they want to provide services in the future. One of the main changes is that many of them were set up as cost-sharing groups, which is a form of legal/accounting model to limit the tax consequences of having the additional roles reimbursement scheme workforce provided across the practices. And that's worked absolutely fine for many practices, and it meant that they didn't need to have CQC registration. Many of these entities are now saying, actually, this new neighbourhood might mean that we could provide more services at a bigger scale, and it could be the right opportunity to have a defined entity that will actually provide it. Therefore, either setting up a new company if they don't have one, or converting one that's been set up in this cost-sharing group arrangement as a full-blown provider, which includes setting up your CQC registration, which is often the biggest hurdle to overcome, plus all your operational arrangements. And it's quite a big change to become a full-blown provider.
So if a network does decide it wants to become a company, what does that process involve, and what are the sort of pros and cons of doing it?
The first point is always to establish why you're doing it. So setting it up purely because you've heard it's a good thing is probably not the right approach. And we've certainly seen several PCNs in the early days that did that and then went, why have we got this vehicle? So the priority is to understand what the purpose of the company is going to be. And they are largely fall into kind of three broad categories. The first is to protect liability of the practices and the partners within the practices. If you are looking at taking on some higher risk contracts or work that might be outside the comfort zone of the core contracts, then it might be a good idea to be able to isolate that in a company that you control and you still run to a high standard, but doesn't ultimately put your house on the line if you're a GP partner. The second category is really about the staffing and the taxation type issues of that. So if you are using it under the current PCN structure just to host staff and maybe some backroom functions, there are tax efficient ways of structuring that in a way that reduces the potential overheads and costs to the practices, whilst allowing all the practices to benefit from that centralized service. And the third category is really about the big picture. Do you see this vehicle as being something that will really be able to provide a service that really gives you and your community value? Is it something that when you look at it, you say, well, actually, the practices can do this. Do we really need a company? Well, you probably don't. If you look at it and say, the practices can't do it, we need to consolidate resources, we need to be able to, we still want to control it, still need to be integrated with it, but no individual practice could do it. And the alternative is we don't want an external provider from our group, then that's the time to go, okay, this is an opportunity to set a company up that can provide those services for us and for our community.
Depending on what your reason for doing it, is there different ways you would set it up?
Potentially. So the most common discussion that we get asked is, should we be setting it up as a company for profit or not for profit? Which is a slightly oversimplistic way. And I always prefer to say to people, move away from the concept of profit, because profit is seen as a bit of a dirty word in the NHS even now. Yeah. But fundamentally, any company and any partnership and any entity that doesn't operate at a profit means that you are operating at a loss by default, which means you're not sustainable. So it's better to think of it more along the lines of, are you looking at it as being an entity that will generate additional revenue over and above the delivery of the services, in which case, what you're going to do with that, is that going to be reinvested into the practices as shareholders or reinvested into the services? Or are you going to be running at a very cost neutral position where you just need enough to tick along and to respond to deliver your services and to respond to the opportunities that come along? That decision can sometimes be influenced about whether or not you should be set up as a community interest company. And that is a form of still a limited company, but it's one that has what's called an asset lock. So all your assets, the money you generate, the equipment you buy, etc., can only be used for a defined purpose. And that's normally a purpose such as delivering health services for the local community,
right,
for example. It has to be almost a quasi-charitable type purpose. There has been previous kind of waves of moving toward KICs. Certainly some of the 111 type providers and the early federation type models, many of them were KICs. The idea being that should stimulate a more kind of cohesive approach with the general culture of the NHS. The reality of it is, though, that many of the benefits of KICs, of how you kind of present yourself, can be achieved anyway.
Wow.
So you can build that into a company without having the additional kind of regulatory obligations. That's one of the kind of key questions. Do we want to have it structured in that particular way or not?
And are there any negatives for setting up as a company if you're a network?
The main negative is the extra workload it's going to entail.
Right.
Because you are running an additional business, you'll have additional accounts, you'll have additional compliance checks and steps that need to be followed. You'd also have to think about, if you're going to be CQC registered, a whole new company that's going to have its own inspections and all the compliance levels, which is significant, as anybody will know delivering services.
Definitely.
You can't simply say, well, I've got a practice or we've got a group of practices that are all CQC registered, therefore it's fine. That is breaking the law. So it has to have that same level of standards. So it can't be entered into lightly when you're taking it to that level.
One of the other things, obviously, the reason that people are quite worried about the advent of neighbourhoods is what could happen to funding. There's been some concerns that enhanced service funding could be targeted by the government to help set up neighbourhoods. So we're probably talking about the money that PCNs receive through the network contract enhanced services, and also maybe local enhanced services by ICBs wanting to get networks off the ground. Is this something that practices and networks should be worried about, do you think?
I wouldn't say they need to be worried about it, but there's certainly the general approach that's being taken is everything's up for grab at the moment. You know, there is quite a positive spin on it. The commissioners and NHS England government have said, come to us with solutions and ideas about how we can make this work. So let's put a positive spin on that. That does, however, mean that everything could potentially be up for grabs. The reality of it is, though, the impact of that could be so damaging to some practices. They would lose such a big chunk of their core funding or core plus funding that they might not be sustainable.
Yeah.
So it'd have to be entered in very, very tight and precise situations. And it's fair to say that this has already been trialled. If we look at the development of vaccinations and the vaccination enhanced service that incorporated the COVID with the opportunity to do flus, that very much was a shift away from each individual practice having their flus, which has always been traditionally a very important part of the annual calendar for practices and a very important part of their revenue. The DES for that basically said, well, you can deliver it collaboratively, provide it in centralized hubs across your PCN. I don't think many actually have, but that's not to say that it's not possible. And I think that's the thing to be aware of. It's all possible and anything could potentially happen.
The multi-neighbourhood provider contracts are probably the ones that, you know, hospitals potentially might be eyeing up. I mean, how can general practice compete with hospital providers if it wants to take control of these? Is it about having federations, or is there any other structure that practices could put together?
So the multi-neighbourhood provider contracts are designed to be very large.
Yeah.
I think they're talking about 200,000, but in practice, what we're seeing with some of the pilot sites out there, that even that might not be the final size. It might be even bigger than that. And the reality of it is, in most areas, there are not the appropriate entities to actually be able to hold those contracts on behalf of primary care. There are some exceptions, and those would be the ones where there's either a kind of established, what we refer to as a confederation of federations that might have, say, cover 70, 100, 150,000 patients coming together for a wider area and saying, we can collectively hold that. Or where it's one of the earlier entities, such as the one-on-one providers, to kind of refer to them again, who often have additional resources and they have the ability to hold quite large contracts. Many of them, the relationship may not be as strong as it could be with primary care, but it's certainly potentially more aligned than they might have with trusts. In most areas, though, I think the reality of it is a trust will hold those contracts, and it will either be an acute trust that provides community services, or it will be a community trust. In answer to your question about how to get involved with those, though, that really does come down to the relationship development and making certain that there's the right kind of voices at the table to say to them, okay, you're holding this big contract. The reality of it is that needs to be broken down and divided down into each individual neighbourhood. So how can we do that collectively?
Right.
One of the key challenges will be to avoid the traditional hierarchy of contracting, subcontracting. Those will have to exist because it's the only way you could theoretically deliver at this scale. But you need to then wrap it around with like agreements or collaboration agreements that have rules that says, you're not just our boss. There's an equal party to this. There's got to be joint decision-making, joint governance. If one subcontractor does something wrong or has an error or has a problem, the whole collaboration has the problem or the error, and that needs to be managed together.
Yeah.
And that's a huge cultural shift that needs to take place.
Obviously, we haven't seen these contracts yet, and so we're not sure exactly what they're going to look like. But whatever happens, really, whether it's big changes this year, big changes next year, or a bit further down the track, there are changes coming on there. So what can GP practices do now and primary care networks do now to make sure that they're in a good position?
The starting point, I always think, is stay informed.
Yeah.
Make certain that you are, at very least, knowing what discussions are happening and when they're happening. It may be too much work to actually be directly involved, but engage with those people who are involved so they know that you're at least aware and you're not being missed out. Because without that, something will be imposed. And you don't know when you need to step up and say, we need to have a say on this topic or this service redesign or whatever it may be. So that's probably the most important one. Stay informed, get involved when you can. The next one that we've kind of been highlighting is try and resolve any disputes and issues that might currently exist within the PCNs. That is so fundamental to the future of relationships at a bigger scale, because if you are being offered an opportunity to provide a service at a neighbourhood, let's say a multi-neighbourhood provider contract's been awarded to a trust, and they say, right, we need the neighbourhood to deliver this. And they look and they say, okay, you're all falling out, you're all having arguments, you're not providing a cohesive approach. How can you deliver in an integrated way and work with us when you can't work with each other? And I know it's far easier for us to say than actually deliver a lot of this resolution, but it's so important to do that because that cohesive single voice kind of mentality needs to be implemented. So wherever possible, resolve the disputes. The next recommendation I'd have is to try and have a clear plan for what you want your practice to do. So never forget that practices are the building blocks of this. If you are looking at a scenario where you don't have a clear future, you've maybe got a number of retirements on the near horizon, you don't necessarily have future plans for recruitment, etc. Now's the time to really address that. Because if you focus on yourselves and make certain that you are as strong and as stable as you can be at a practice level, then that will build the foundations for the rest of the discussion. And once you've had that, also do the same with your PCN. Have those relationships to plans. Where do you want it to fit? And then that will feed into the neighbourhoods and how they want to develop. The final one that I kind of really highlight, and it is, you'd say, typical lawyer, but it is where possible, have your paperwork appropriately drafted and up to date. We still see arrangements where you ask for a copy of the network agreement schedules and you get a document that was signed in 2019 that didn't have any variations or any any reality. And they've had changes to their membership and they've had all sorts of issues.
Yeah.
So there are opportunities here. It's just a case of getting that strong foundations to be able to respond to the change.
All right, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for speaking to me today, Robert. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks again to Robert and thank you for listening. You can watch an extended version of this conversation on our website, GP Business. There's a link to that in the notes for this episode. I'll be back next week for Talking General Practice's regular news review, so please do join me then and visit our website, GPonline.com, for all the latest news.